House Bill 519 is regarding voting for incarcerated persons. And so the present law, as you know, already authorizes incarcerated persons who are not under the order of imprisonment for conviction of a felony to be allowed to vote. And so the present law also presents problems for incarcerated persons who are registered by mail but have not previously voted in person. So this bill would authorize an incarcerated voter who is otherwise authorized by present law to vote absentee by mail, or to vote absentee by mail for the first time after registering by mail. And so it is dealing mostly with allowing those who are incarcerated to vote. And we have worked with the sheriff's office and other parties.
Have you spoken to the registrars of voters organizations to see if they are willing to do this?
I have not.
So your original bill had the sheriffs doing the collection.
Absolutely.
And my question there would have been, are the sheriffs in favor of doing that? As I understand it, the law is that the first time that you register if you register online, the first time that you vote, you have to do it in person. This, of course, cannot happen if someone is incarcerated. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, I don't know why you want to change that portion of the law.
The reason for it is because we wanted to take the improprieties totally away from the sheriff's office, given that in many instances sheriffs are on that ballot, and we wanted to be sure that there were no ideas of anything going wrong.
Okay, I'm actually asking about voting in person.
I'm answering your question that you asked, why we put the amendment in.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem.
We've had many discussions in here about the roles that different the Secretary of State, the Registrar of Voters, and then even third-party outside organizations play. And I think it's been stated many times that Registrar of Voters should play that primary role in just voter registration in general, even including conversations with high schools that are required to allow the opportunity for students to register. And so it kind of makes sense that they that in a more difficult situation, in that there is nobody else. The sheriffs, it's not their job or role, and that the process be directly connected to the Registrar of Voters. Is that your reason for making this?
That's the intent, yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Carpenter, let me just ask, make sure I'm clear on this. We're talking about individuals who are legally entitled to vote.
That's correct.
But because of one reason or another, they are incarcerated.
Right.
And that incarceration does not deprive them of the right to vote.
That's correct.
But their being incarcerated prevents them from the actual act of being able to exercise the right that they have.
At this point, yes.
Okay. And you are posing a procedure by which they are allowed to exercise that right, and of which, if you don't provide that procedure, they don't have the ability to vote?
Yes.
Okay.
There are several exceptions that allow someone to vote first time via absentee ballot. If they qualify under the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, if they qualify under the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped, if they have a medical issue and they get a doctor's note and then they send in a copy of their ID, you're allowed to vote absentee ballot for the first time. If you are a student and you're attending a school outside of your parish, as long as you send in your school ID with your application, you're allowed to vote for the first time via absentee ballot. In Louisiana, however, if you are incarcerated, and let's be very clear, we're not talking about people who are incarcerated on a felony conviction. So folks who are in a Department of Corrections facility. We are talking about people who are pretrial detainees waiting for the adjudication of their case. So if they register to vote and they have not voted in person for the first time, they are because they are not a listed exception, they are unable to vote because they are required to vote by absentee ballot. That's in the law as well. If you are an incarcerated person pretrial, you must vote via absentee ballot. And so what the substantive portion of this law is, it creates a mechanism so that if you are incarcerated pre-trial, you have equal access to the absentee ballot, just like if you were a student or if you were in the military or if you were disabled and had a disability. So I think that answered some of your questions, Representative Thomas. So we're not creating just an exception for someone who's pre-trial. There are several exceptions built in, and what this does that Representative Carpenter put in is just make sure that there's equal access to those who can get access to the ballot, and would actually probably bring our law into compliance with the National Voting Rights Act and the Constitution, both for the United States Constitution and the federal Constitution.
I mean, you clearly identify a conflict in the law where someone has the right to do it, and we constrain that right to a absentee by mail ballot, and there's no mechanism in place where certain individuals can actually participate. And so I think you've identified something that we definitely need to correct. Let's talk about incarcerated, okay, and what that means. It's a broad term, but under current law, who within the incarcerated population is eligible to vote?
Yeah, I can answer that question. Thank you. So I think what we should be really clear is that this bill is about people who are detained pre-trial.
Correct. Not under an order of imprisonment.
Not under an order of imprisonment in the Department of Corrections. So this bill will not do anything to the Department of Corrections. Will not put any sort of obligation on them. What it does do, then, I want to just make clear as well that if someone who is incarcerated for a misdemeanor offense, which you can be, most people get probation, but you can be incarcerated for a misdemeanor offense, you've not lost your right to vote. And most likely, if you're incarcerated for a misdemeanor offense, you're in the sheriff's custody and control. You don't go to the Department of Corrections. So this still would help those
right. And so my point
as
is,
well.
people have not lost their right to vote.
Correct.
Therefore, they're entitled to right to vote.
Correct.
We, the state of Louisiana, the legislature has created the process by which they must vote, and it's absentee. And so we're just effectively correcting a few deficiencies in, our constraints on providing the people who have the right to vote who happen to be incarcerated because, innocent until proven guilty, and they're not under an order of imprisonment. So
that's correct, Representative Ivey.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask, you keep referring to that this only applies to pre-trial incarcerated. Where in this bill does it say it?
This is the substantive component of it. Subsection little f. A person incarcerated in an institution inside or outside the parish in which he is qualified to vote who requests to vote absentee by mail pursuant to revised statute 18:1303G. So that's the limiting factor here. So if you are incarcerated under a felony conviction in the Department of Corrections, you don't fall within this particular exception. You don't fit that definition that's there. And this subsection F falls under the list that I had read earlier.
One other question then. Students have to provide an ID.
Correct.
Somebody else that you mentioned had to provide an ID. How do these incarcerated provide their ID?
That's a great question. So if you pull up the absentee ballot that I put in the package, the section that's highlighted that says incarcerated says the only way that they can get a ballot is if the sheriff also encloses a certification that this person is who they are. So the sheriff is providing that certification that that person is who they are and that they're incarcerated.
So that's their ID is what you're saying?
Yeah, because they don't have it. Their ID is, if they had it on them when they were arrested, is in property. So they don't have access to the ID.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem.
You mentioned the logistics of it, which it is. It's just a logistical issue. Now, these absentee ballots, I'm assuming, are the same ones that get sent to everybody else. they have the flaps and things like that. So the whole process for ensuring the integrity and security is in place with this, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so I'm going to assume that, sheriffs, whoever runs the facility, that, delivering mail is a very normal part of what they do, on a daily basis. Okay. And so by doing the absentee by mail, at least getting the ballot to someone after they've, requested it, through the current process, that's just as simple as handing the ballot off, and delivering it to the prisoner, correct? Yeah.
Soon,
Okay.
yes.
And so, do you know what the process they have right now of collecting those ballots? Do you know what they do now? Does it vary?
I can't speak for every parish, how the registrar is working with the sheriff currently.
So it may
It's
not
only-
be a
it's-
uniform
like
process.
I said, it's only been a handful over the last years in my parish. And I appreciate your questions. And one thing I wanted to add was sometimes you'll mail the ballot and they've been released. So, that's accounting for the ballots that were sent with the applications, like you're saying, and then accounting that the ballot was received. That's going to take, some effort on the registrar to make sure that all.
But that's
matches.
something y'all do every day already, correct? Because somebody can
So this
have.
is going to be another little step we're going to have to figure out how to do.
Well, but I mean,
to
the
be-
process of looking at who you have received an absentee by mail, completed absentee by mail ballot from, and updating the poll books, okay, on election day is something you do already.
Yes.
And so this doesn't really add nor subtract. It's just there's no different process.
No, I was referring to the issue of custody between the sheriff, the jail, and getting to the ballot to the registrar's office.
Okay, you're saying getting the ballot to them. Okay.
No, getting it from the jail is part of this, correct? Getting
Okay,
the
so
ballot
you're saying
to
by
my office. Part of it is saying the registrar shall go to the jail and
Correct.
pick up the ballots.
Correct. And so if they could simply collect them, right? I mean, that they pick up mail too, I'm assuming, right? That they could simply collect them. And again, I think that, and I don't know if we need language or anything to do it, but, basically just, and I appreciate the sheriff's intent of, wanting to appear above board, particularly since the sheriff is an elected official, possibly allowing y'all to promulgate some kind of rules or things like that on that process to where it's clear. And, if it's a locked box or something like that where an inmate can drop off their completed ballot, and that way it kind of prevents anything, and then y'all could simply pick it up. Obviously, y'all should pick it up once and not over a period of time. And so nothing entitles anyone to require you to pick it up early. But I think we can streamline this where maybe it's even more efficient than what the current process is. So thank you.
We touched on it. This is for pretrial misdemeanor, and the pretrial part, I think, I was on criminal justice before I came here, but that's actually a lot of people. Like if you go to the local jail, it's like half of the population in a local jail, right? It's a lot of people. So, I mean, just trying to Google about how many it is, it says maybe about 15,000 at any one time in Louisiana. And these are people that aren't convicted of anything, right? They're in pretrial detention, but we keep them there, sometimes for the entirety of their what they may eventually be sentenced for. And then a lot of the times they end up just dropping the charges and letting them out. So they don't actually ever, they may never actually be convicted of something. So anyway, that just kind of puts the scope of what the population size is of this. It's not like one or two people. It's actually a pretty big group.
Yes, it is a large percentage of people, but we don't know of those 15,000 people who is registered to vote. And then furthermore, we should assume that, for instance, in the second to last election in New Orleans, I think only 8% of the population participated in elections. So if we were to say only 8% of those 15,000 people are going to participate, I don't know how many people we're actually talking about. I'm not great at math. That's why I became a lawyer. But
yeah, no, I'm just saying.
but I'm just, we just can't say, 15,000 people are now going to be.
I'm not
voting,
saying it's
because we don't know if-
15,000. No, I'm not saying it's 15,000 people. Therefore, we shouldn't do this. I'm saying it's 15,000 people who theoretically should have their right to vote no matter what, right? And
if they're
it's true.
registered and they want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that, it's, maybe more of a hassle if you have 15,000 people, but I don't think that's a reason to say, well, we should deny them a box to check to send in the form, right? Which is really what we're talking about. And yeah, I think you're right that most of those people may not just in the general population. Most people
I don't want to
vote,
make an
right?
assumption, but when we look at voter turnout,
maybe Representative Ivy's
very
right. They
well
don't have
be the
anything else to
same.
do. Maybe they'll vote, I guess, But anyway, I just wanted to point out kind of that how big that population is, and that it really would affect a lot of people if they choose to avail themselves of it, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
The past several weeks in this committee, we have discussed allowing people who have touched our criminal justice system to be allowed to either regain their rights to votes, and in this instance it's retaining a right that they have not lost. And I thank you for bringing this clarity, and each time we sit in this committee, I hope my committee members are learning something new about our criminal justice system. And I'm glad you pointed on the how broad the term of an incarcerated person is. In law school, we learned it, but that's not something that you typically learn or know in every day. When you think of incarcerated, you think of just somebody in Angola, doing 15 to life, and not somebody just waiting to see the judge for the first time since they've been picked up by the police. So with this, I do see that the sheriff will be allowed to submit applications for more than just one person. Does this change or this exception, no person except the immediate family of a voter shall send by fax or hand delivery more than one applicant? This that covers this.
It does, but it makes an exception just for the sheriff's office or their representative. So it doesn't now all of a sudden allow me to fax in.
Oh,
six,
no.
Yeah, so I just want to be very clear. It just is, it's so that, because if there's 100 certifications they have to do, I'm not going to tell a sheriff how to run their business, but it might be easier for that employee who's printing up those 100 certifications to just then stick it in the fax machine. And so we want it to give that option to the sheriff and their employees if they want to take it. They could also just give the certification back to the individual who's incarcerated, and they could take their application by mail ballot with the certification, fold it up and put it in the mail and return it. So it's a permissive amendment to the current law just to make it easier for those sheriffs who want to do it that way.
I would like to move HB 519 as amended favorably when the time is appropriate.
Nancy Landry, First Assistant Secretary of State, and Sherry Hatsky, our Commissioner of Elections.
Hi. Will the passage of this bill create a loophole for incarcerated, and does it drop the requirement of identification verification? Does that what this bill would
My
do?
understanding that it does. We have an election integrity safeguard in place that when someone registers online or through the mail, they have to come and vote in person the first time so that we can verify their identity. And this bill would allow them to drop that requirement and allow that safeguard to make an exception to that safeguard for incarcerated people, which we don't allow for law-abiding voters.
So if, for whatever reason, they're incarcerated and they're not able to go and vote that first time, are we saying, and they may not be convicted or anything, but I mean, they're in that situation, are we saying that their vote, that they're just not going to be able to vote because of the circumstances? I mean, isn't their vote just as important as those of us who aren't incarcerated, such that we do everything possible to ensure their vote, whether they're voting for us or not, and to, at the same time, maintain the integrity of our elections? Isn't there a way? I realize it might be a little bit more difficult, and it is somewhat aggravating because it's not your or my or your department's fault that they're incarcerated. It may not be their fault. But isn't there a way to accomplish both?
If they're already registered to vote, then they can vote by mail.
Okay.
So that's not an issue. What we have a problem with, and Secretary Ardoin apologizes that he can't be here today. He was not feeling well, but it's the policy of the Secretary of State that we do not make it make exceptions for people who are incarcerated that exceptions that we don't provide to law-abiding voters.
But
and that
yes, ma'am, I don't mean to interrupt, but
this is an election integrity safeguard that we have to verify the identity of someone who registers
it's
other than in person.
It's real easy, and I catch myself doing it all the time, that because someone is incarcerated, we immediately call them lawbreakers. They may be. There's probably a good chance they are. But until they're adjudicated to actually be guilty of something, shouldn't they be afforded every right?
Say I'm 17 years old, I turn 18, and I join the Navy before I have a chance to vote the first time. I can't vote in Louisiana because y'all can't verify my ID. And they shipped me out to San Diego my first week.
Under UOCAVA, I think you could. There's an exception under federal law under UOCAVA. That's a federal exception.
Okay. I'm pretty sure, though, that I can't say everyone, but I think almost most sheriff's office in their jail, and I think that's what we're talking about. I think this bill almost exclusively applies to sheriff's jail when you really break it out. They keep a roster with the ID, with the person's name, not social security number, but the identifying information with a picture that's available on the website. Almost all of them do. So you can go and click on the website and you can see who's there. There's an inmate roster. So they do keep these records. It's not like we don't know. Am I wrong on this?
The current law that allows the registrars, as Mr. Champagne said that they do, allows them to work with the people in their parish. Where they run into trouble is the person is registered to vote in Caddo, but they're incarcerated in West Baton Rouge. So then you've got to engage a different registrar going to do this process, and then you have to get that ballot from that registrar to another registrar, and we don't currently have avenues for that. So we need to look at that portion of it. And we also, one of my biggest concerns that I have right now, the smaller rural parishes where they only have 2 employees that work, a registrar and a chief deputy. Right now, they're allowed to do nursing home voting, but during a presidential or a gubernatorial, when you're trying to, and you can't send a commissioner, it's got to be somebody that really knows the elections laws that's going to go and do this process. So it would need to be the registrar or the chief deputy. And so selecting the time frame and the number of people, and if it's a gubernatorial or a presidential, I get the calls from, we're drowning, we can't get to the nursing home, is there any way anybody could help us? So I want to look at several aspects of this to see how it would work across the state. And I don't think we would want to pick up a ballot and try and mail another ballot to another registrar, and I'm just not sure how all of this would work. So I'd like to have the opportunity to look at the amendment and see what could be done.
Okay. Representative Ivey with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem. We've covered a lot, and shouldn't we safeguard the right to vote as much as we safeguard election integrity?
Absolutely, but the right to vote is tainted if the election is tainted. We have to make sure that the elections are safe and secure, and that we're, the person who says they are who they say they are we have to make sure that they are who they say they are on the application, and we do that by requiring in-person voting for the first time that somebody votes when they apply online.
Right, but we have exceptions as been discussed, and if we review again those exceptions, our uniformed overseas citizens, absentee voting will be, they can do that, or the voting accessibility for elderly and handicapped, which elderly and handicapped isn't. I mean, unless it is their first time to vote, I guess they could register late, right? But and then also special program for handicapped voters. So these are things where it's circumstances, outside of their control from a voting perspective, because obviously they signed up to be in the military and things like that. So there's exceptions to these circumstances, and we have in place, and the process works fine for them, right? And so I don't understand the difference just because someone is physically located in a prison facility, which if you want to, if you ask me, you should have more confidence in they are who they say they are, because my God, if they're not, I don't know, how do you do that, right? Somebody's civil rights have been violated to a significant degree. So, we allow authorities, like in the case of, apparently the issuing authority of a student ID, which is a university, which is probably run by students printing out IDs. I mean, there's more opportunity for, fraud should, again, I don't suspect it, but there's more opportunity there than someone who's physically incarcerated has to get a letter, a document from the sheriff to include in their application. I mean, that's a pretty definitive source of truth for acknowledging that the person who's applying is who they say they are. And so, it's easy to throw, issues on top, on these things when it's very practical. Look, it doesn't take a creative imagination to deal with some of these concerns. And again, I absolutely am the strongest advocate for election integrity and security. But like I said, y'all can promulgate rules. If we need to provide for authority to do so, y'all could promulgate rules where there's a locked drop box where these things can be put in. Again, whatever's necessary. There's a lot that we can do to ensure this. That's really not a big deal.
We're not in favor of drop boxes anywhere, including in a jail. So we would not be.
This is what I'm gonna suggest to Representative Carpenter. It's her bill. What I'm hearing from the committee is that I think there's support for passing this bill out of committee. I think we also might want to give the Secretary of State's office and the Registrar's office time to review the amendment set, since it was substantial. Would Representative Carpenter be okay with deferring this until the next meeting to come back and give them, and y'all can talk in the in-between time and iron out? I mean, I do think we want to do this as a committee, is what I'm hearing. I think that they have some real concerns about language and issues, and that would give y'all some time to
And we would like to get a fiscal note on it, because it would involve some programming changes.
Whatever to try and see what we could work out between now and then. Representative Carpenter.
I'm still hot, I think.
Sorry. I understand, but we have members. We have a long agenda that we're still only a quarter way through, and if we can move some of these things along, and Ms. Carpenter will come back at the very next meeting hopefully with an amendment set that solves everybody's issues, I think we can process along. But I'm offering it right now.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your offer. I would be interested in being able to work between here and the floor, given the time frame that given the time frame that we're working with. If that is all right in the wishes of the committee, I pledge to work with the Secretary of State's office on this bill between here and the floor.
Ms. Haskett, would you? The question is, with this bill being as it is and the measure we have, will you be comfortable if we just did not do it? We did nothing with this issue at all, and we leave it particularly the way it is?
If you leave it the way it is, the individuals do have a mechanism to vote by mail if they've registered to vote prior to the 30 days close of books. Statistically, when we're looking at the number of people that are first-time voters, it's not very high. But I would like to know that. I would like to look at that and see what we're talking about. I know from participating, working early voting, working election day, on average, we don't see very many first-time voters. They're generally 17 or 18, 18 years old. They were registered at 17, came to first-time vote at 18. So I think that that's important. I think it's also important to take a look at these registrar's offices. I think it's important to look at how we would move the ballots. I think there's just some logistical things that we really have to look at in order to make it work correctly.
Well, when you say correctly, I don't know what you're referring to, because we've heard the debate over the last 45 minutes. We had Mr. Champagne come by, who's a registrar, talked about basically the low number that he has in his parish. In larger parishes, there may be other numbers, but they have a spirit that he displayed of willingness to do whatever necessary to do. He even said that we're basically his bosses to do what we want to do. And even talking to my registrar of voters, I know that they particularly want to do whatever they can to assist. However, their numbers are low in staff. but we always refer to the fact that the registrar should do this, the registrar should do that, when those guys are doing the best they can with the numbers that they have. So if you sit there and listen to testimony and you heard everyone say that particularly there is an issue here that we need to correct, and you keep saying now you want to look at it, you want to keep looking at it for things that you have problems with, the consensus is on this panel pretty much, I'm not speaking for everybody, but I can feel the fact that we think there's an issue here that needs to be addressed.
Nobody works harder to protect people's right to vote or to make sure everybody votes than our Commissioner of Elections, Sherry Hatsky.
Am I
And I
insinuating
guarantee
that?
you that she works enough for 5 people, and she's been dedicated to this job for over 30 years. So I'm going to step in her defense right now and say that there's nothing that she ever says no to. She will do anything, and she will bend over backwards to make sure that people's right to vote is protected. And so if you want to address those comments, I would ask that you address them to me, because I'm her boss, and I'm the right person to say, if you want to fuss at somebody like it kind of sounds like you were doing, like we're not being deferential enough to you. Of course we're going to do whatever you guys want us to do. You are the ones who set policy. So we are willing to do whatever, but there would be some programming changes that would be required to create another exception in our registration system, and that will cost money and it will take time.
The right to vote is the absolute most cornerstone part of our entire democracy. And I've heard everything I needed to hear in regards to that the folks that we are trying to help today have not been deprived of that right. That's still their constitutional right under our system. So we need to do whatever we got to do to make sure that they have the ability to cast their vote. Because the second you impede anyone's ability to cast their right to vote, for the lowest amongst us, then it doesn't mean anything to all of us either. So at the appropriate time, I'll move favorable.
Representative Boyer? No. Representative Wilford Carter? Representative Desautel? No. Representative Farnham? Representative Gadberry? No. Representative Ivy? Yes. Representative Jenkins? Yes. Representative Mike Johnson? Yes. Representative Lacombe? Yes. Representative Lyons? Yes. Representative McGee? Yes. Representative Nelson? Yes. Representative Newell? Yes. Representative Thomas? No. Representative White? 8 yeas, 4 nays.
The House Bill 519 reported to the floor as amended.
Thank you,